Hello, everyone, and welcome to our study of Origins, the book of Genesis. My name is John Walker, and I'm sitting with Bruce Watsek, the minister of the Princeton Church of Christ. Bruce, as we study Genesis, why is it so important to look at Genesis from a cultural and literary perspective?
I think it's important for us to understand that the Bible is very relevant to us today, but if we want to really get the full depth of the meaning, we have to realize that we are not the only or the original recipients of this document. Instead, this document was written in, first of all, the Old Testament to a ancient Mesopotamian culture. For it to be relevant then, it had to speak to the issues on the minds of people at that time, not necessarily to all the issues that are on our mind. Last week we spent some time talking about some of the literature that comes from the ancient Mesopotamian world. We have enough of their stories, which was their equivalent of science, explaining how the world works. And of course, from their perspective, the mythologies discuss warring gods, and it discuss a variety of other things, trying to explain how the world functions the way that it does. And so to understand the Old Testament, especially this initial opening poem in chapter 1 of Genesis, we have to put it in its historical and cultural context, which is 3,000 plus years ago in the ancient Mesopotamian world. Number two, when we read the Bible, we just need to know what kind of literature it is we're reading at a given point. That makes a difference. For example, narrative, which is storyline, is a great deal of the Old Testament. But the Old Testament also has law. And when you read the laws, they read differently. The narrative has to be understood, interpreted differently. Poetry is different than narrative. Also, wisdom sayings of the ancient world have to be understood differently. And those are the basic types of literature. Much of the prophetic literature was written in poetic form with a little bit of narrative going along with it. So as we look at this first chapter, most scholars interpret this as poetry. And you see that, by the way, they indent these verses going all the way from chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. And so poetry is telling truth, but it's not telling it in the same way that a science paper would, or that a narrative or story would. And so we have to be careful as we look at it, not to be overly literal. Poetry, by its very nature, is not trying to be overtly literal. Now, of course, as I said, coming from the 21st century, with science and technology being an important part of our world, we tend to ask a lot of questions about the material universe and how it came into being in the processes. The ancient world was not asking those kinds of questions. So to expect the original writer to overtly direct his statements to us would mean that it would have been irrelevant to the thoughts of people up to just 200 or 300 years ago. So that's not happening. Instead, he's addressing the people of his time. And so as we engage in this, we want to keep in mind the cultural background, and that this is a point that starts the Bible off. I'm going to start it, John.
Yes. Chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. Bruce, what are the two possible ways we can interpret Genesis chapter 1?
So the big overarching ways that you can look at Genesis chapter 1 is you can look at verse 1 as an introduction, and the rest of the chapter explains how the heavens and the earth were created. This is a more traditional approach. But I think it's also possible to interpret Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 as an independent statement, and that starting with verse 2, we're picking up down the road. We're not discussing how God created the universe. We're talking about a point in time when, instead of the initial creation, it's a restoration of creation. It's a overcoming the chaos in order to bring order so that human beings could live in this world. And so with that in mind, I get that from verse 2. Verse 2 doesn't sound like that it's talking about how the earth was made, but it's talking about the earth being in a certain form. It translates two Hebrew words, tovu and botu. Now, this is interesting because the second word, botu, only occurs when it occurs in conjunction with the first word. It's never found by itself. And this double occurrence only occurs here and two other times in the Old Testament. And to understand what it's saying here, I think we have to see how it's used elsewhere. Now, tobu is used in several other places. We'll notice another place it's used. But these two words that are translated in my translation, formless and empty, is the state of the earth. It's going to be important for us to look at what these might mean. What are they suggesting to us? And to gather that, we need to look at the two usages. The first one's in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 11. John, you want to read that for us?
Sure. The desert owl and screech owl will possess it. The great owl and the raven will nest there. God will stretch out over Edom and the measuring line of chaos and the plumb line of desolation.
Yeah, so in the context here of Isaiah 34, he's talking about the destruction of Edom. God is saying, I'm going to bring a terrible destruction on your land. And so he tells the results of this terrible battle and conflict that's going to cause their mountains will be soaked with blood, and on he goes. This will be, the Lord will have a day of vengeance and retribution. So then he's saying, what's going to be left after this terrible destruction, catastrophic destruction brought by the Lord? Well, you'll just have this desert owl kind of tooling around, and you will see instead that God is like stretched out over Edom, a measuring line. So this is one of the tools of construction, a measuring line of chaos is one of our words. And then the plumb line, to see that things are going to be done right in construction, is going to be desolation. So that's our two words. So the context is a great conflagration is going to come on Edom, and it's going to end up in destruction, chaos, and desolation. It's going to be formless, and it's going to be void. So that's the context of this one. So that should make us think, perhaps this is suggesting after a great conflict has occurred. Then Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23 is the only other occurrence of this word. You want to read that for us?
Yeah. I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty, and at the heavens, and their light was gone.
Yeah, so again, the words here are translated in such a way that they jump right out at you. Look, the earth was formless and empty, and heavens, and their light was gone. That's the same kind of description that Genesis 1 verse 2 is giving us. But in this context, it has to do with God acting in a catastrophic way, bringing judgment on Judah. So I'm going to bring an enemy from the north, and the end result of this is going to be formless and void. The land is going to be totally destroyed. So my point on all this is that the usage of these two together only occur in other contexts besides Genesis 1, where there's been a great conflict and where the end result of it is chaos. And so with that in mind, remember what we read the mythologies of the ancient world said. They believed that before the earth was made, or fully made, it was in some kind of form, that there were gods and they were in conflict with one another, killing off one another, subduing one another. And only after they finished this battle among themselves did they get around to transforming the earth into something habitable and livable. And so I would say the Bible is assuming the same thing, except it doesn't believe all the mythological characters that some of the ancient Mesopotamian literature has, but it believes that, as the Bible later says, that there was a rebellion in heaven, that the rebellious angels were expelled. That's where we get the serpent who appears in the garden. He was a part of the rebellious forces that rebelled against God. And so I would say by the usage of these two words, it's heading to anyone that knows their language, there's been a conflict and everything has been destroyed. So with that in mind, let's notice, as we look further, notice how Tobu is used one more time. It's very relevant to us. And let's see, Isaiah 45.
In verse 18, for this is what the Lord says, He who created the heavens, He is God. He who fashioned and made the earth, He founded it. He did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. He says, I am the Lord, and there is no other.
So, again, it alludes to God creating the heavens. And what does it say? He made the earth as well. He did not create it to be tobu. He did not create it. So if he didn't create it to be empty, then why is it empty? Well, obviously there's been a counter response to God by oppositional forces, spiritual beings that are in opposition to God that have kept him from keeping the planet that he made in a habitable form, just as the ancient mythologies. And we'll notice that this idea about creation and there being spiritual beings at war is a theme that occurs throughout the Old Testament. We'll look at a couple of examples of this warfare worldview of spiritual conflict that went on before and continues to our own day. Let's start with a familiar verse, hopefully, to us in the New Testament, Ephesians 6, verse 12.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms.
So he's reminding the Christians our battle is not against people who may manifest evil, but there are powerful spiritual forces behind these evil people and evil schemes that are our real opponent. And so therefore he reminds them, then he goes on, so you need to put on your spiritual armor so that you can be engaged in a spiritual warfare against these beings. And in the Old Testament, there are a number of allusions to these spiritual beings. Sometimes some of them are named. Leviathan, Rahab is also named. And we'll notice this as we read back in the Old Testament examples that refer to creation and the conflict that these animals involved in. So the first quote is from Job 26.
Beginning at verse 11. The pillars of the heavens quaked aghast at his rebuke. By his power he churned up the sea. By his wisdom he cut Rahab to pieces. By his breath the skies became fair. His hand pierced the gliding serpent.
And so you see that it reminds you a little bit of the Tiamat story we read, that where was a serpent monster, sea monster that was cut in two. Here in this particular account in Job, it tells us that the Lord was involved in a conflict with this spiritual being that stirred up the sea. Because to begin with, the whole thing of Genesis 1 begins with the sea covering the earth. And there's darkness, so there's a cloud formation over the whole earth, light's not getting through, there's no doubt rain and flooding. So the sea is that which must be conquered and put in its place. And of course, we see God at work fighting to cut Rahab in pieces. Now, of course, this is a spiritual destruction of Rahab, because Rahab keeps popping up at other times. It's like Satan being defeated, but he keeps coming back with his minions. But here is a clear allusion in Job that those that were reading Job were very familiar with the stories and realized that God himself was involved in fighting these spiritual beings from the beginning of creation. And then let's look at a couple of verses in Psalm 74 to begin with.
Beginning at verse 12, but God is my king from long ago. He brings salvation on the earth. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the water. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. It was you who opened up springs and streams. You dried up the ever-flowing rivers. The day is yours, and yours also the night. You established the sun and moon. It was you who set all the boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter.
So here it's a clear creational context, referring to God as establishing the sun and the moon. Talks about him setting boundaries on the earth. This is like the boundaries of where water could be and there could be land. And it says that it crushed a many-headed sea monster, Leviathan, crushed its many heads. And of course, this in the book of Revelation, it tells us this same serpent, many-headed serpent, is still present, is now, it says that ancient foe, which is clearly the Genesis account, and the Leviathan in the Old Testament. Whether this was exactly Satan or another spiritual being, whether this is a name for Satan or this is a name for one of the rebellious spirits that in Rahab, we can't say for certain, but we can say that these were rebellious beings of some spiritual power that God overcame. And again, much of that had to do with the power of water. I mean, think about it. Tsunami comes and we're destroyed. A flood comes and people are destroyed. There's just a variety of ways that water, hurricane, through water. I mean, water can be very destructive. And just the regular ocean, by stirring up the waves, could destroy the boats of the ancient world quite easily. And so it was viewed that the most unruly parts of the world were the seas and the waters. And so there was a sense in which the opposition to God was most powerful in those places. So again, this is not an allusion to creation, but it's also, by the time this psalm was written, an allusion to the Red Sea again. Here's where God goes in and conquers the power of water in the Red Sea, parts it so his people can go through, closes it to destroy the Egyptians. The same thing when they crossed the Jordan during flood season. When Joshua led them into the land, he parted the waters there too. So it's showing God's power over water that can create chaos and death. So let's look at one other one, Psalms 89.
Beginning at verse 5. The heavens praise your wonders, Lord, your faithfulness too, and the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies above can compare with the Lord? Who is like the Lord among the heavenly beings? In the council of the holy ones, God is greatly feared. He is more awesome than all who surround him. Who is like you, Lord God Almighty? You, Lord, are are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. You crushed Rahab like one of the slain. With your strong arm, you scattered your enemies. The heavens are yours, and yours also the earth. You founded the world and all that is in it.
So clear allusion to creation again, but here it refers to a heavenly council of the holy ones, as it refers to. In the book of Job, they're called sons of God gathering in the holy council. So this is another term for angels, but it also could be the seraphim and other spiritual beings that elsewhere in Ezekiel and Revelation we read about, are the cherubim. There are a variety, perhaps, of angels or of other spiritual beings, and they are gathered to praise and honor and respect God because they know that He is the all-powerful one and that He destroyed the opposition, which included Rahab as one of the spiritual beings in opposition to God, again in conjunction with the sea. That's why in Revelation it talks about the new creation coming. It says there was no sea. So the idea is the rebellious sea has been completely eliminated from the new creation. But the bottom line on all this, the point that I want to make is Old and New Testament views spiritual beings created by God, free will beings, that have revolted against honoring God just as human beings have. There are faithful spiritual beings, angels and others, but there's an opposition force as well, and they contest what God is trying to accomplish on the earth. And they initially create such a conflict that the world is totally destroyed, and God has to bring it back into order again. And that, I think, is what's done in Genesis chapter 1.
So Bruce, when we talk about Genesis and the creation account, did God create the earth in 6 24-hour days?
Now, again, if we keep in mind it's a poem, that might help us a little bit. But the writer gives us another hint. Now, some of the modern translations obscure this point, but one of the more literal translations, well known, is the King James Version. And John, if you'll read it, this is chapter 2, verse 4, kind of the summary statement that leads us into the next chapter.
These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens.
On the day. So in effect, if you take that literally, it's saying God created the earth in a day. We just got through describing 6 days and then a seventh day. Well, which is it, 1 day or 6 days? Well, the answer is probably neither one. It's not trying to tell us that this is, 6 24-hour days. The word there is the Hebrew yom, but instead, it's trying to, the fact that it uses 7 is presenting the basic order of human time. The time should be day and night, but it also should be ordered in 7-day weeks with a day of rest at the end of it. That's what it's trying to tell us. God has created order, and part of that order is creating a 7-day week with some rest in it for human beings created in the image of God. And another reason I think that this is not a step-by-step description of how God created the heavens and the earth is on day 1, we have light. And we don't have the sources of light, quote, created until the 4th day. Well, how can you have light? Well, of course, you could come up with explanations for that. But it's better to not read it that way and to seek to maybe understand it the way the original readers might have read that. And here's the bottom line. Verse 2 is describing a chaotic situation. There's complete darkness on the earth. That's what we call a nuclear winter today, which super volcanoes have created in the past, or an asteroid hitting the earth and throwing up so much stuff into the atmosphere that literally darkness was over the entire earth for long periods of time. And when that happened, of course, it made the world uninhabitable. Matter of fact, one of those events eliminated 98 to 99% of all creatures who are on the planet at that time. That we know through some of our science. So this is talking about a catastrophic event like that. Now, keep in mind, the writer starts off by talking about, I think, the creation accounts in verse 1. It's saying, this world didn't come into being by accident. It had a God. And in the beginning, so there was a beginning. The material universe isn't eternal. Instead, there was a beginning, and God created everything. And instead of explaining all that, he picks up with the story later on as human beings are going to come into play. And he describes how God had to, assuming a conflict of spiritual beings before, God and perhaps his representatives fighting the opposition. Now God, by his word, begins to restore the creation. So if you can imagine after a nuclear winter, what's the first thing that there's some hope? And that is, instead of pure darkness, you see light coming through the dark clouds. You can't see it well enough to, there's light and then it goes away and then it comes back, but you're not seeing the sources of it. You're instead seeing the object of the light itself is unseen. And so I think that's another reason why I believe that that's the creation account. So let's pick up back in Genesis and continue on. Let's read some more of the text out of Genesis.
Sure. Resuming at verse 6. And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land. And the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water and the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.
All right. Let's concentrate our energies on the verses up to verse 26. And then we'll deal more specifically with human beings and their role. But as I'm describing, after a nuclear winter, it's kind of a process that the world gets healed. First thing that you're going to see if you're standing on the earth is light, because there's not complete darkness. The cloud cover is not too thick. And then there's got to be a beginning separation where you can kind of tell when there's light, when there's darkness. And so you're able to see that something is producing light, something is producing darkness. And God begins to restore the earth step by step, day by day. And it's the kind of things that you would expect. First of all, God divides the waters. And it says he puts a vault. And so that's kind of an interesting word used to be a tent. So it's the idea that, the ancient world thought of, the waters above were held back and then they rain at certain times. You want them to be under control. Only want so much water, not too much water. And so they refer to a vault, an empty space in between the realm. And so only then could you begin to then gather the water to its various appropriate places. And the water begins to recede from what has happened as a catastrophic event occurred. And you begin to see land. And when land comes, you begin to see there already was seeds there. And so they began to produce vegetation that was essential for life on the planet. And then what's interesting is then it describes that God providing the lights to serve as an organizer of seasons and special days and years. So how we're going to organize time has to do with the sun. One round of the sun to its original place is 1 year, approximately. And so you needed these light sources which began to appear to be able to tell time. So for the ancient people, they weren't concerned about, well, is that a solid disk or is that a fiery? They were unconcerned. It's like, what does it do? Well, it helps us tell time. Sun's essential for our existence. In the darkness before, there could be no human lasting existence. But then something interesting kind of hints at what the writer is trying to say. In verse 16, it said, God made two great lights, the one to govern the day, the other to govern the night. Now, he's talking about the sun and the moon, but he doesn't name them. And again, remember, I think the biblical account is a polemic. It's a argument against the pagan mythology. In pagan mythology, the sun and the moon were deities. The stars represented deities. But in the creation account, they aren't deities at all. And so he intentionally doesn't name them just to show they're not that big a deal. Not what the Egyptians think they are. They're not gods. And this word in verse 16 used twice, two great lights, one to govern the day and lesser light to govern the night. This is a different word than light that occurred earlier. This is a Hebrew word that's only used a few times in the Bible. Here, the lesser lights, the sun and moon. It's used 10 times in the book of Exodus and Numbers to refer to the light produced by the menorah in the tabernacle. So you see the symbolism is that the tabernacle is providing a microcosm of the cosmos. It's like, the holy place was all the fabric was blues and purples like the sky. And then the only light inside the holy place in the tabernacle was the menorah. And it had 7 stands. Now, in the ancient world, people, besides the sun and the moon, there were 5 other major stars that appear to be stars, some are not stars, that appear to be lights in the sky that people use to try to tell time and seasons. And so some think the 7-fold of the menorah light was a reflection of this, and it provided the only light inside the tabernacle. So what that's hinting at is that the tabernacle is a miniature of the original creation, and the original creation was God making his own temple, and he intended that to be the earth, and he provided light for the earth, and he provided waters under control for the earth. And that, if you will, from an ancient perspective, we'll have to study more to get the fullness of this. This appears to be a description of the creation of a spiritual temple. After the conflict is over in the ancient mythologies, then you restore order to the creation. And then human beings would build a temple to worship their God. And then it would say that the God then could rest. Well, here in this count, human beings don't have to build a temple for God. God builds his own temple. Only later on, after man's rebellion and sinfulness, when God is trying to reestablish a place on the planet, does he tell them to build a tabernacle so that he can reside in a place symbolically in the presence of his people. And so the tabernacle is a recreation of the cosmos in symbolic form. But as you look at this, this is a natural development. On the other hand, you would see after recovery from a terrible, catastrophic event, then come the various creatures and the birds, etc. They begin to inhabit. And only after all these are functioning do we finally have the creation of man. Now, the important thing, notice over and over again, a repeated statement, and God saw that it was good. So God makes a realistic comment on what he's doing. And it's good what? Well, it's beautiful. That's another way to translate it. And the other way would be a functional way. It's good for the creatures he's going to create at the end of the story to live in this temple, for human beings to live in this earthly temple that God has created. So these things are all good because they provide the environment, the circumstances where that can take place. And so why don't we go back to Genesis and look, if you will, verse 26 through chapter 2, verse 3.
Then God said, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living thing, every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of your whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So Bruce, here, it's interesting. For the original readers, what does the image of God suggest to them? And also, God resting. What would that mean to the original reader?
Yeah. So all these terms tend to mean different things to us today. But if you put yourself in an ancient Mesopotamian environment, what was an image? An image was an idol that you would place in a temple once it was completed to represent the God who had made it. And so to say we were image bearers of God doesn't mean we look like God. But the idea is that instead of a piece of wood or stone that people put together and called an image of a God, we are the living images of God that God has placed. So we are, in contrast to the pagan temples and their idols, we are what God created to inhabit his temple, which was the whole earth, which he made habitable for us. And so I think, first of all, that idea would come to mind. In the ancient world, sometimes they believed in divine kingship. That is, that the king was part divine, or had somehow been made by God or designated by God to rule over this city or region, a divine kingship. So they were also referred to as they were the image of God as king. Well, that also fits the narrative because he goes on to describe what's their purpose. What are males and females that he makes in his image? What are they supposed to do? Well, he says, you're to rule over all this creation that I have made. You're to be rulers. Let's put it in other terms. You're to be royalty. Men are princes of God and women princesses of God. So to begin with, God didn't intend for there to be some elite group of people that are kings and queens of royalty and for the other people to serve them. Instead, he created every human being with equal dignity and worth, all royal potential as princes and princesses of God. It's with royalty in training so that we could rule over the world in a just and a loving way. We could take care of God's good creation. You know, the only problem I have with some environmentalists today is it's very clear when you listen to them, they worship the earth. And they really don't see human beings as more valuable than any other of the creatures or even the plants. And I think when you have that kind of view, you're like the ancient pagan. Instead, God is saying, God made all the beautiful earth, but human beings are given a responsibility. We have capacity to rule in the place of God, to be his designated representatives on the earth, to take care of it. So we should be taking care of the earth, but we shouldn't be worshiping it and making decisions as if the earth was deity and had to be worshiped. That's a reversion to the ancient way of looking at things. And then notice what his mandate is to couples, male and female. He says he blessed them, told them to be fruitful and increase in number. So here's an interesting point. Remember in the myths we talked about of Mesopotamia, the gods got concerned because of overpopulation. And they tried by droughts and floods and other things to lower the Earth's population because it was getting too crowded and human beings were too noisy. That was what the ancient story said. Well, human beings and secularists are about population control. In 1969, it talked about, a book came out in 69, 68, the population bomb. It predicted that the population would be a certain size within 20 years and there would be rampant starving. Half the world population would be starved because we're overpopulating the earth. Well, the population grew even larger than they predicted and has continued to grow. And actually, there's less starvation in the world today than there was in 1969. So the point I'm making is there's still people that are trying to curb populations, and yet God never does. Be fruitful and multiply. This planet if you take good care of it, will take care of you. Don't be trying to overly control this. The pagan way of seeing things is wrong. That doesn't mean you have to have 50 kids, but it does mean that you shouldn't not have kids because of some fear of overpopulating the earth. But the second thing that he tells them to do is to fill the earth. So he expects the human beings to move about and to fill the earth. I'd say we've done a pretty good job of that over time. And then finally, he says, and subdue it. Now, the word here for subdue is the idea that you have opposition and there's going to be some kind of warfare to subdue the enemy. So even though in God's action, he overcame the chaotic, conflictual forces in opposition to him to restore the earth to a habitable form, that doesn't mean the spiritual beings in revolt against God have all gone away and there's no opposition. But the first couple should expect opposition. And they're going to have to subdue, they're going to have to conquer the opposition. There's going to be a spiritual warfare going on. And of course, we will read more about that in chapter 3. But he warns you, that's part of your divine purpose. And so at the end it says, God saw all that he made, and now it's only good, it's very good. So at the 6th day it says he rested because he had accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. Now, what would the ancient world think about God resting? Well, we have a variety of accounts that this is after the gods had conquered the chaotic forces, restored order, created the universe in some way, and had human beings there. When the human beings finally finished the temple, then the God could rest in his temple. And they thought he would now be fed, given food and drink, so all his needs would be taken care of, and he could rest in his temple. So that would be the thought that would occur to the average ancient person. And so, interestingly enough, God rested, but in the sense of ceasing from the initial restoration of creation. But instead of God taking a nap or going on a trip to Disney World, he says, I'm giving you 1 day a week. You ought to not do work. You ought to rest on that day. So humans rest on God's day of rest, not the gods. And so this is a counterpoint to what was being taught, because the ancient people didn't operate on a 7-day week. They thought in terms of a month, more or less, and they would tend to work 7 days a week. They might take a festival day for a God part of the day, but they felt like they had to work all the time to survive and to bring their food to the gods so that the gods would be appeased. But we find the true and living God doesn't operate that way. And instead, God makes a day of rest for us in his wonderful temple, the beautiful earth that he's created, that he's asked us to take responsibility to take care of and to fill this earth, but not with just population, but with people that recognize we are image bearers of God. We are God's representatives. We have to know God to be able to represent him. And the great problem is that human beings have many times lost true knowledge of God, and so they don't represent God. Or some people, even if they are told about it, reject the idea of submitting to any authority greater than themselves. But that becomes part of the human drama a little later on.
So there's some ancient writing out there, the Enuma Elish. And would you like to?
Yeah, let's do that. This will give you a little feel. We didn't read this section last time, but it tells you about the rest from we read sections from the Enuma Elish, ancient Mesopotamian writing.
Now, some excerpts again. We will make a shrine which is to be called by name, chamber that shall be your stopping place. We shall find our rest therein. We shall lay out the shrine. Let us set up its emplacements. when we come thither. We shall find rest therein. When Marvin heard this, his feathers glowed brightly like the day. Then make Babylon the task you requested. Let its brickwork be formed, build higher the shrine.
So here it says, the final act of building the great city that Marduk had supposedly saved from the chaos forces was that they're going to build a very high temple to honor their god Marduk and provide a place where he can rest. And so in the ancient world, that's one of the ways they would have thought about it. Another idea would be rest occurred when there'd been a great warfare and the warfare ended and you had a period of rest. And so this would suggest the warfare with the spiritual forces in opposition to God had been pushed back. God had restored creation. And so now there is a sense of rest from the warfare initially. Doesn't mean warfare won't come back. And instead of God resting, so to speak, he gives to man as a gift a day of rest.
And just in closing, how do all of these ideas found in this poem apply to us today?
There are a number of them. I just want to summarize a few of them. First of all, it's important to recognize that the Bible assumes a spiritual warfare is going on constantly. Remember when Jesus came, half of what he was doing was teaching, and the other half of what he was doing was casting out evil spirits and healing people that had been harmed by evil spirits and restoring their sight and casting out demons. Jesus was in full conflict with evil spirits. And remember, when he was on the water and a great storm came up and threatened to destroy them, Jesus rebuked the storm just like he rebuked the demon-possessed man called Legion, because he recognized there were spiritual forces at work in the water threatening to kill him and his disciples in the boat. So again, the point is there's a constant warfare, and yet we live in a world today where we fight bacteria and things that we can see in microscopes. But people have pretty much given up on that there's any spiritual conflict going on. As one person said, the best lie Satan ever told was to convince people he doesn't exist and that forces of evil don't exist. And so if you don't really think they exist, they can easily manipulate you and control you. And so from the very beginning, there's been this conflict. And it continues on throughout the pages of the Bible. Secondly, we know that the earth was a spiritual temple. God intended it to be a place where human beings could live in a right relationship with God and each other, multiply and fill the earth with image bearers of God, just like you would images in temples. You would spread it over the whole earth, and the whole earth would be a worshipful place for God. How do we know that's the vision? How does the book of Revelation end? It ends with a new creation of new heaven and earth, and then the next chapter it says this huge, square, massive thing, the heavenly Jerusalem, which is part Eden paradise and part city of Jerusalem, descends and basically covers the whole earth. So in the end, there's going to be a spiritual temple that's somewhat Edenic because it's got rivers flowing through it and tree of life, etc. So that's how people understood the message in the New Testament. We've just lost sight sometimes of what the Bible was originally teaching, and therefore we can't make full sense out of the rest of it. And then, of course, we are living images of God. We have a responsibility to our environment to take care of our world, as well as to fill it, which means we've got to raise our children to be true image bearers. We've got to reach other people. It's like the Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations. That's a continuation of the purpose of making true image bearers of God to fill the earth with them. And I think also just recognizing we are a royal priesthood. So this is a temple. But who are the priests? Well, all human beings are intended to be priestly figures who worship God, as well as royalty. So a combination of royalty and priest. That's what God's original vision was and what it was setting forth in Genesis 1. It'll do more so even as we proceed in the story in Genesis chapter 2. And to see if we're correct in this interpretation, let's close out with a reading of 1 Peter 2, verse 4 and 5, and then 9.
As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Verse 9, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light.
So what are we supposed to be? A royal priesthood. Well, where did that idea come from? Well, that idea came from the original creation account. And of course, have human beings lived up to being royal type people? Have we treated others as if they're royalty? Have we all functioned as we should as priests of God, taking care of the world we're in, taking care of other people? And the answer is no. And that's why the world still is filled with violence and evil, because people don't know what God intended us to be from the beginning. And in Christ, he's trying to restore God's original intent for us. And so we're recovering, just like he recovered the earth in Genesis 1 from the destructive conflict. In Christ, he came and defeated Satan. Satan's still around, still fighting, but he's been defeated. And now we're trying to recover that original purpose of God, become true image bearers of God ourselves. And through Christ, we can. And so I think these passages say a lot to us. There's a beginning. That means there'll be an end. There is time. Time was created by God. We live in that time, but eventually where God lives will be, and there is no time. Therefore, there can be eternity. And so for those of us that choose to be a kingly priest of God, there is a hope of immortal life. Remember how Gilgamesh epic, he was searching for immortality. Finally, he thought he had it in a plant, and a serpent ate it. That's interesting. The serpent took it away. Well, in chapter 3, we're going to find that God's original intent for immortality for human beings was temporarily taken away too. But in Christ, God is restoring that hope. So there's a lot of powerful truths taught in these passages, and we'll be going to chapter 2, and we'll be being a little bit more with human beings and what God intends for them as we look at chapter 2. John, you want to close us out with a word of prayer?
Sure. Dear God, we're so grateful to you that you are God, and we can be your people through your Son Jesus and our obedience and faith in him. Father, we thank you for this lesson, the explanation of origins of the world, of us, our purpose. And Father, how you made it that we could fulfill the purpose that you set for us from the beginning of time. Father, we thank you for Bruce and his ability to teach so clearly this amazing lesson, and all those who have that in attendance. We pray that we have all been edified by this amazing lesson. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Good night, everyone.